Welcome, everyone, to this film screening of Blossoms and Thorns, A Community Uprooted. My name is Tom Leatherman. I'm the superintendent at Rose of the River World War II Homefront National Historical Park. At the Visitor Center, every Thursday, we show this film in conjunction with the Contra Costa JACL. And today, after we screen the film, we're going to have two former incarcerees, Flora Ninomiya and Ben Takeshita, and the filmmaker, Ken Kokka, who are going to talk to you about the film. Please enjoy.
Richmond residents may recall the greenhouses that once lined Interstate 80, just southwest of San Pablo and McDonald Avenue. Many of these structures were originally built in the early 1900s when Richmond was driven by its agricultural economy. Demolished for redevelopment, these greenhouses are a reminder of a nearly forgotten Richmond industry, the cut flower business, which once provided a way of life for many Japanese immigrants and their American-born children.
Japanese immigrants found their employment opportunities were limited by discrimination and language barriers, but some found that they could grow cut flowers as a way to make a living in their new country. Cut flowers could be grown on small plots of land outside of urban centers. The crop could be grown quite quickly and could be sold for a relatively high price, which allowed these immigrants to make a living to support their families. Richmond was a good place to grow flowers because there was good weather here. There was public transit to San Francisco, so people could carry their flowers in to sell at a flower market. And there was plenty of open land that could be had at an affordable price. So a few years after the turn of the 20th century, a number of Japanese immigrant families came to Richmond and established the flower growing business here.
Many of these early immigrants purchased land in Richmond, giving them a foothold in the region before anti-Japanese laws prohibited them from buying property. Japanese American growers realized early on that they needed to collaborate to combat discriminatory business practices. Combining forces with Italian American and Chinese American growers, they established a flower market in San Francisco, which eventually grew to form the heart of the wholesale cut flower business for the entire Bay Area region. In many respects, Richmond's Japanese American flower growers embodied the American dream, immigrants creating better lives for themselves and their children through hard work and sacrifice. But this success also led to resentment and a backlash against them. Legislation was passed banning Japanese immigration to California, purchasing of land, and marriage to American citizens.
Anti-Asian activism was rampant throughout the West Coast, but it was particularly virulent in California. This was an outgrowth from the reaction to Chinese immigrants who'd come decades earlier. As Japanese immigrants began arriving in larger numbers after the turn of the 20th century, you saw an escalation of hostility toward their settling in communities throughout California. The Japanese American community had a very distinctive shape. There was the first generation of immigrants called Issei, who were not allowed by law to become American citizens. And then their American-born children, who by virtue of their birth here were citizens, they were called Nisei. They grew up feeling both American, but also very much shaped by their Issei parents' experiences.
The Maidas had a place, and their home was on Wall Avenue, and the Oshimas was on the corner of Wall Avenue and San Pablo Avenue. And behind our nursery on Wall Avenue was the Oishi's family. And across the street from the Oishi family was the Sakai family. So we were just surrounded by friends.
Unlike Japanese Americans in larger Japan towns, Richmond, on the other hand, had a small community of Japanese Americans who lived in semi-rural areas among what were primarily other immigrants, mostly from Europe.
German, Italian, Polish, Greek, Portuguese, Japanese, no Chinese. So I was brought up in a more or less a white neighborhood. That's why when the war broke out, I felt Now I'm as good as the next man.
With the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Tom would soon find his beliefs put to the test.
After Pearl Harbor, the FBI and local authorities rounded up community leaders in Japanese American neighborhoods across California. These included priests, teachers, prominent business people.
And it seems so unfair to us now that I look back at it, because my father, although he was from Japan, went to school in Berkeley, and he went to junior high school, he went to high school, and then he went to the University of California. He was bilingual, and he was a very peace-loving person, and we still to this day don't know why he was picked up by the FBI.
And that was actually the first of a number of assaults on civil liberties in the months leading up to relocation. People's movements were restricted, their bank accounts were frozen. Here in Richmond, anyone who wasn't a U.S. citizen was told they had to move away. Because of the Kaiser shipyards, Richmond had become a defense prohibited zone. And all of the Issei parents who were actually prohibited from becoming citizens were told that they needed to move.
And so we were saying, oh, see, that's because you're Issei. And then the second notice came that we had to move too.
I myself not believe that we were going to be interned. I thought, how could they come and intern an American citizen?
At the time that his parents were relocated out of Richmond, Tom himself was working as a welder in the Kaiser shipyards. But Tom, like everyone else of Japanese descent in the western United States, would soon be forced to leave his home. On February 19, 1942, barely 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the relocation of nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast to internment camps. Richmond's Japanese American families scrambled to make arrangements to care for their properties and businesses.
You've been this for 30 years. You have 30 days to clean up, take care of your lease, your personal belongings, but not enough time.
There was a knock on the door, and it was T. Ninomiya. We referred to him as Mr. Ninomiya. And so my father invited him in, and I remember he sat at the head of the table. My father moved over, and my sister and I were just the children. And I remember what Mr. Ninomiya wanted. He asked my father as a friend.
He asked my dad if my dad could watch over his nursery.
And our father said, yes, I will do it.
The majority of Japanese Americans from Richmond were relocated initially to Tanforan Racetrack in San Bruno before being moved to their ultimate destination, Topaz, Utah.
It was some big surprise to me that we had to relocate or go to concentration camp.
And they said that you could take only what you could carry. And that was, that was no good.
It was hard. The food was bad. Living conditions was bad. My room was Joe, my oldest brother, me, Hannah, Lucy, my mother and father. The wall was only up to 8 foot high. The pitch part of the building was not sealed off. It was open. So when your neighbors talk too loud, you could hear everything they say.
Topaz is a nothing place. It's just nothing there for miles. And just the barracks, just like the army barracks were there. You had to make your own happiness.
We ended up in Granada, which is in Colorado. It's the southeast corner of Colorado, and it's quite desolate. Very, very much a desert, lots of sandstorms, very, very cold in the winter. So we found it a little bit difficult for our family.
For more than 2 years, Mrs. Ninomiya had to raise her 5 young children on her own until Mr. Ninomiya was finally transferred from a concentration camp in New Mexico to Grenada. No formal charges have been filed against him.
I think it was very trying for especially my mother, my parents, both my mother and father. My mother constantly worried about my father, and I'm sure my father constantly worried about his family. He was gone for so long that when we finally saw him, we did not really know who he was. We didn't know how to communicate with him. So that was strange too. And it kind of bothered my mother because we didn't really trust this guy that came to join us and, join our family. But we did work things out. It took a little time, but we did work things out.
It was not a relocation center. When you have guards, live ammunition pointed at you, that's no relocation center. They thought we were very dangerous.
Despite their wrongful incarceration, many Nisei fought for the right to join the American military. An all-Japanese-American unit, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, was eventually established, serving with honor and distinction in Europe, while friends and loved ones were imprisoned behind barbed wire in America. In 1945, 3 years after they were evacuated, the first wave of internees began returning to Richmond.
We did have our home to come to. We had our nursery to come to. And in that manner, we were very, very fortunate because it was in perfect condition because the ABs had taken care of our place.
Nearly all of Richmond's Japanese-American flower growers returned post-internment, but most were not as fortunate as the Ninomiya family.
We had some Caucasian family or couple or something take care of our place, but they did a terrible job. They took all of the plants, the rose bushes that we had. We were rose growers. My father was a rose grower. And they took all the plants out of the greenhouses. We had 11 greenhouses. Broken glass was on the beds where we had to plant the next crop, My brother, my two brothers, one brother and my father had to clean all of the little tiny glass with chopsticks.
For the Japanese Americans who were able to come back to Richmond after World War II internment, they found that the community had changed dramatically. What had been a small town of about 23,000 was now over 100,000. And the empty acres of open land that surrounded many of these nurseries was now filled with blocks and blocks of defense housing, apartments built for the shipyard workers.
Most California Japantowns were not rebuilt after World War II. People had lost their property, their businesses, and the federal government actively discouraged what was known as recongregation. Richmond was unusual in its high percentage of Japanese Americans who were able to return and rebuild their lives and community. But they were all changed by their forced dislocation at the hands of their own government.
I think I was more bitter. Well, I think just like age group, the amount of education you have has a lot to do with it, where you were educated. I was brought up in San Francisco. They were all restricted to certain blocks. If you die, your cemetery will have a Japanese cemetery. You go to church, you go to a Buddhist or Christian church. So the Japanese more or less had to stay together. But here in Richmond, I felt being the son of an immigrant, being in business, I felt I was as good as the next white man. So when the war broke out, it's a different feeling altogether.
Why did they do it to the Americans? We're citizens. We all thought that, but what can you do? It's done. you sort of don't trust the government anymore. And it was a mixed feeling.
Richmond's pioneering Japanese American growers continued to set the national standard for quality cut flowers for decades upon their return, until competition from foreign growers pushed them out of the industry once and for all.
In many ways, the history of Japanese American immigrants parallels that of other immigrant groups to the United States. They arrived, they settled, they built businesses and cultural institutions, and they raised families. But there are other aspects of Japanese American history that are very distinct. Japanese immigrants were targeted by legislation in California and by the federal government that restricted their opportunities, that curtailed their ability to become citizens and even to come and settle by 1924. And of course, World War II internment affected immigrants from Japan in a way that it affected no other community in the United States.
In 1983, a report of the Commission of Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians concluded that exclusion, expulsion, and incarceration were not justified by military necessity, and the decisions to do so were based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988, signed by President Reagan and passed by Congress, provided for a presidential apology and appropriated $1.25 billion for reparations to internees and others of Japanese ancestry who lost liberty or property because of discriminatory wartime actions by the government.
I think that this story of what happened to a whole generation of Japanese Americans, 2 generations, is very, very important, that people understand that Japanese were sent to camps, concentration camps, and they lost so much of their lives during the years that they were in camp. Many lost a lot of their savings. They had very difficult trying times to recover their lives after the experience. So I think that we have to educate and tell this story to Americans so that they understand that it was wrong and we can't repeat this mistake again. It's important that people are treated with justice, with fairness, and we have to make sure that the government doesn't make the same mistake again.
I think the panel's all here. All right, welcome everybody.
Thank you.
As I mentioned, I oversee Rosie the Riveter World War II Homefront National Historical Park in Richmond, and we have the opportunity to share with people what happened on the home front during World War II. And obviously a lot of people think about Rosie's, but the story of Japanese Americans and what happened specifically in Richmond and across the West is an important part of that story as well. So when the JACL was working on this film, they approached us and asked if we'd be willing to show it at the visitor center. And every Thursday we do that. And if you are able to come, and we're not open in the visitor center right now, but hopefully if the COVID pandemic levels off a little bit, we'll be able to open the visitor center. And every Thursday we show this film. And we are fortunate to have folks that come and share their own personal experiences. So 2 of the panelists are former incarcerees, and I want them to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their story. And then we also have the filmmaker, Ken Kokka, who I'd like to have him share a few words with you as well. So why don't we go ahead and start with Ben Takeshita. Ben comes and shares, again, his personal story. He and his family were at Tule Lake. And so, Ben, I'm going to let you go ahead and share a little bit about what you do when you come into the visitor center.
Okay, the reason I'm here actually is because many of you may know about the loyalty questionnaire that occurred to those people, 120,000 of us who were incarcerated in one of 10 America's concentration camps. So my story starts way back in the 1920s and 1930s when there was a lot of job discrimination against Asian Americans and Japanese as well as other kinds of laws against Japanese. And so many of the Japanese families used to send their sons and daughters to Japan to learn the Japanese language so that when they became adults, they would be able to get a better job with a Japanese company who were coming into the United States and so on. So my 2 brothers, older brothers, they were 10 and 13. They were sent to Japan in 1934 and stayed until 1939. But when they were in Japan about the mid 1930s, Japan started a war with China. And as a part of that, then they wanted to recruit as many young people to join the Japanese military. But many of the Kibes are people, American citizen Niseis, who went to Japan to be educated and then returned to the United States. But anyway, many of the Kibes refused to join the Japanese army, saying that they are American citizens. And fortunately, the Japanese government accepted that rationale or reason and did not put them into jail or punish them and let them continue with the Japanese education. So my brothers did come back in 1939. The war started in 1941, December, as you know, and in May 19th of 1942, our family we were living in San Mateo. We were bused to Tanforan racetracks to spend incarcerated there, and then from there in September of 1942 went on to Topaz, Utah, and that's when the loyalty questionnaire was authorized for all those 17 and over had to fill out. Well, my brother was 22 at the time, and he felt that this was unjust, unconstitutional, and therefore he tried to tell as many people as possible to answer those 2. There were 2 loyalty questions, 27 and 28, and he wanted to encourage people to answer those in the negative, no, as a form of a protest for what the U.S. government did to 120,000 of us by incarcerating us. So he did that, and the FBI did question him as to his intentions. And I have a written report about my brother's FBI report, which says that he did it as a form of protest for what he did in Topaz. But then, regardless of that, the federal government decided that all those who answered in the negative, those 2 loyalty questionnaires, we are to be sent to Tule Lake. So we ended up in September of 1943 in Tule Lake. Then there was a rumor that all of us who were sent to Tule Lake will be eventually sent to Japan as an exchange for the U.S. soldiers that Japan had captured, and in exchange for that. So then my brothers, especially the bilingual people, decided that they better teach us kids Japanese so that we would survive in Japan. And so we started to go to Japan, and I spent my 2 years in Tule Lake learning Japanese. My brother was again interviewed by the FBI, and then they kept him for a month. And once the they were over. They took him out, put him against the wall, offered him a cigarette and a blindfold, and he could see there were riflemen right in front of him with rifles. He heard they put the mask on, and he heard their command: ready, aim, fire. But then no bang bang. It was a click click click, meaning that there were no bullets in there. Naturally, my brother didn't know that, so he thought this was the end of his thing. So after that incident, this was to show us people in the camps that they have the guns. They're the ones that rule over us, so obey them. So that was always part of the atmosphere that we felt while in camp. My brother, because of this kind of treatment, he because of his bilingualness, went back to Japan. One of the first ones to go back to help Japan recover from all the bombings that occurred, and also the atomic bombs that were dropped in Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. And we, in turn, after the war ended, where we came back to the San Mateo, where we started out with, and to start a new life in our own. So that's my story. Hopefully, within the 5 minutes that I was allowed to give you that part of it. There are a lot more I'd like to say, but certainly don't have the time. Thank you for
Well,
listening.
thanks, Ben. And we're going to have more time because then we're going to get questions, and there's a chance you can probably elaborate on some of your story a little bit later. So next we have Flora Ninomiya, and I think you'll all recognize her from the film. But she was the first incarceree who actually came to the visitor center, and she was every Thursday she was introducing the film when it started out. Now she's got Ben to help her out, but she was very dedicated, and it was really important for her to come and share her story, and we really welcomed the opportunity to make that first person connection for people. So Flora, why don't you talk a little bit about your family's story?
Well, first of all, I have to mention an iconic member of Contra Costa JACL, a civil rights worker. Her name is Chizu Iyama, and she still lives in our community. She returned to the board of the Contra Costa JACL in 2009 for the sole purpose of producing this film. And she was our leader to say that there's a new World War II museum being built in Richmond, and we have to tell our story. My family was part of the pioneer group of Japanese Issei, first generation Japanese who came to Richmond and El Cerrito to start a nursery business for their family. At the start of World War II, there were 20 families in Richmond, and all of the families returned to Richmond except one family. And so I tell the story of how my family was able to return to Richmond. And the first was Francis A.B. Sr., whose children appeared in the film with us, because Francis A.B. Sr. had his nursery right across the street from our place, and my father prevailed upon Mr. A.B. to take care of our property. And he did a wonderful job. He was honest, he worked hard, and he made it possible for our family to return. There was another reason that our family was able to return, and I did not know this story until I was an adult. There was a mortgage on our property, and this mortgage was held by a small family bank, local, 2 branches, and it was owned by Edward Downer Jr.'s family. Mr. Downer held our mortgage and the mortgages of most of the other Japanese families in Richmond. Quietly, without even revealing this story to his family, he held our mortgage and he made it possible for our family to return. So it was because of these two iconic men that our family returned to Richmond. I also tell the story of our family being within the camps. I was only 6.5 years old when we had to leave Richmond. But on the very day that we were leaving Richmond, my father was arrested by the FBI, and we did not see him for most of the time that we were within the prison camps. My mother, Anise, had to take care of 5 children, her father-in-law, my grandfather, and we all went to camp together. And so I do tell the story of being within the camps. I tell of the struggles that my mother went through, and I try to explain to the people that come to Rosie the Riveter that it was a difficult time for many Japanese and Japanese Americans. So I'm very, very thankful that Rosie the Riveter is so welcoming to hear our story. And I'm thankful for being able to share our story with the new generation of Americans that come to hear our story. Of course, we get to connect with other people within the museum, and we do have one iconic member that I must mention, and she is Betty Reed Soskins. She is a park ranger with the National Park System, and she is the oldest living active park ranger in the system. And she tells her story of being a Black woman in the time of World War II. And so I think that it's not, Rosie the Riveter is not just the story of the Rosies, and we still have Rosies that come to our museum, all of whom are in their 90s now. And so we all share our story, and I feel very fortunate that I can do this. And I'll try to keep doing this as long as I can. Thank you.
Thanks, Flora. Well, you certainly are welcome. Well, I want to finish up. We actually already have some questions, but I want to finish up with our final panelist to just share some thoughts with you, Ken Kokka.
Well, one of the things that's been interesting for me is the life of this project, and it was in a certain way, it's like a meat and potatoes documentary about what happened, and yet it speaks to some very deep things. And you know, it was done by a committee. It's sort of goofy that I'm speaking for as a filmmaker when it was very much a group project, and it was, you know, the Contra Costa JACL and the video committee, and Donna Graves and Jill Shiraki in particular had a great deal to do with all of the content and putting it all together. But what's pleased me the most about this project is the discussion that can flow from watching it. I participated in a Q&A 5 years ago, and at the time I said something that a friend of mine later said it really struck home with her about a year after that. So, and I was like, what did I say? And I said, you're kidding yourself if you think this can't happen again. You're kidding yourself if you think this can't happen again. And over the last 4 or 5 years, we're starting to see some of these things starting to happen again. And so we have to start calling out racism. We have to start calling out our government. And so for me, the thing that I really appreciate about watching the doc again is the little afterword that Flora gives, which I think Flora and Chizu were very much instrumental in saying we need to have something that really talks to why this is relevant now. And I thought that Flora she spoke about that very eloquently, and about vigilance, and that we as citizens have to be looking at our government, and we have to be questioning our government. And now we're actually in an environment where we can speak about racism specifically in a way that's been very hard to do for a very long time. And I think we have that opportunity. And if this doc gives a little bit of an opportunity to say, like, this is something that happened before, how does this parallel what's happening now? That's a contribution. So I'm very happy that I was able to participate in that.
Well, thank you, Ken. As you've seen from Flora and Ben, they're able to come and share their stories. And I know the people who come into the visitor center enjoy seeing the film and learning about the history. So let's go ahead and move over to the questions. The first question comes from Satsuka Winchester, and she says, is there a good book or documentary which looks specifically at the variety of discriminatory laws, local, state, and federal, against Asians before World War II? Who wants to take that one?
I can speak to a couple of books that I've read that are not exactly answering that question, but kind of touch on it. So specifically about the Asian American experience in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's a book called Living with Flowers, and that touches on a lot of the life of Asian Americans coming into the Bay Area, into the flower industry, and it speaks to the discriminatory practices. So that's one. And then the second book, which again, this is not before World War II, but it does speak to Ben's experience. There's a book, and I would just recommend this for everybody who is interested in this subject, is there's a book called Free to Die for Their Country. I think the author is Eric Mueller. I think that's the name. I'm not positive, but the title is definitely Free to Die for Their Country. And it's about the resistors, the no-no boys, the draft resistors, and the struggles that they encountered. So those are just two things that I would say are worth reading. Okay.
All right, let's go to our second question. It's from Hanako Wakatsuki. How do you feel watching the film now? And do you feel like the country has learned from this history?
Well,
Flora?
I really like the way Ken spoke about the relevance of our story to today, because at the end of my talk, I always talk about how what had happened to the Japanese and Japanese Americans seems to me is happening to immigrants, undocumented workers, the dreamers, all those people today. And so I think our story is really important, that we keep bringing up the fact that this did happen. This incarceration of American citizens did happen. And at the time of the incarceration, the Nisei didn't have a voice. And also, after the experience, most Japanese Americans did not speak about their experience. And it took until I think, the 1960s, when the third and fourth generation, the Sanseis and Yonseis, heard about this story. They started asking their parents, and they finally made us speak up. And so that's how I feel. We have always kept silent as Niseis, and it really took the next generation to really make us speak up.
Yeah, I add that currently also it makes me inspired because politically there are still people are saying things like they want to use our World War II experience as a precedent to put other people into camps and so on. So that makes me work a lot harder and try to spread the word out to people that, hey, this happened here in our United States and we don't want it to happen again to anybody. And that's my incentive to keep going in this story that we have.
If I could tack on to that, I really believe that it's important that Japanese Americans speak up and speak out and give voice when we see injustice, because I think what's happened is there are some people who point to the Japanese American experience and then the quote unquote success of the model minority, which I reject, and say like, well, listen, they suffered and they don't say anything and they're doing great. So what's the big deal? And I really think that's the wrong way to be looking at the subject. I think that is twisting something in a really wrong way. So I had an uncle who I loved dearly, and he used to say, why do we keep talking about this? You know, that's the past, that's past history. And I didn't understand it at the time. But, you know, there's also this element of internalized shame about what's going on, and you want to forget and you want to put things behind you. But if we do that, it allows us to remain, it allows the larger public to remain ignorant about things that are really important, and then things start to repeat. And then you just look at what's happening in Portland, where you start to see the federal government starting to get involved and basically, like, you know, taking people off the street. This is scary if you think about it in the context of what happened to Japanese Americans. It doesn't feel that different to me.
All right, thank you all. So Hanako has another question, and this one's directed at you, Ben. Can you tell us a little bit more about your brother's experiences? Since being in Tule Lake and segregated, did they have issues after the war with the greater Japanese American community, like I hear others did?
Well, my brother was not an active person in terms of opposing this and that. In Tule Lake, he's and some other Kibes started a Japanese language school because we were told that we would be exchanged for prisoners of war that Japan had of U.S. soldiers. So they wanted to teach us kids how to speak Japanese. So they started almost 1 month after we arrived in Tule Lake. We started the Japanese language classes, and that's where I was there, and my brother was teaching. And as a result of the teaching there, the FBI wanted to talk to him again about his activities in Topaz and so on. But he wasn't a rabble-rouser, so to speak. In Topaz, he did what he had to do because he felt that it was unconstitutional for putting us into camps without any trials or hearings. And he knew that, and that's why he spoke out in Topaz. But in Tule Lake, he was just more a teacher and so on. The FBI did catch him, question him again because of his activities that happened and because Tule Lake was, again, a lot of the no-nos were there, and there was a lot of strikes and so on. So they wanted to check with him again to see what he was doing. But he was more a steady instructor with the Japanese language school. And he went back to Japan, one of the first ones to go back, because he felt he could do better there than the mistreatments he received in the United States. And when he first went there, the Japanese felt that, why did you come back? Because they were hard up on food and so on. And so he wrote back to many people into the lake saying, don't come back to Japan because you're not invited, and it's hard for people to feed and so on. So he did do that to try to stop some people from returning to Japan right after World War II. So he did a lot of that. But then 10 years later, he did come back and in San Jose, because he's knew a lot of electronic things, and he got hired at a company that wanted to start a company in San Jose. So he was the leader of that, and so he came back to San Jose to start up this electronic company. And so, and then 10 years later, he went back to Japan, where he passed away several years later. But he was doing his best, trying to make a living as best he can on the circumstances.
All right. Thanks, Ben.
I think that, it's very, very interesting that when this incarceration happened in World War II, all the Japanese that were in a certain area went into the prison camps without resistance. 120,000 people, except there were 3 people that actively resisted and did not enter the prison camps. They were all Niseis. They all were arrested by the FBI. They were all tried in federal courts, and those are the 3 people that were tried in the federal courts. And it's very, very interesting. Fred Korematsu, who is from the Bay Area, I know the family because they were a nursery family. Fred Korematsu did not go into the prison camp voluntarily. He was arrested. He was tried in federal court. And then he was sent to join his family in Tanforan at a temporary camp there. But when he got into the camp, he was somewhat ostracized by his fellow Niseis. Most of the Niseis that were in the prison camps were patriotic. They were Americans. They had been to American schools. They spoke English. They all complied because they had to. They had no voice. The one person, Fred Korematsu, enters Tanforan, and he's ostracized by his fellow Niseis. He was not respected for being the one person in that camp saying, you're doing something that is illegal. And so all during the time he was in camp, he had a very, very difficult time socializing with his fellow Niseis. And all of us realize this. And so as a child, and when I returned to Richmond growing up, I was always unable to share my experiences with my fellow students because I was embarrassed. I didn't want to talk about it. And so we have to really respect those 3 men who are able to openly resist. They were the only 3 people.
So if I could tag on to that, there's a great documentary about Min Yasui, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Fred Korematsu. It's called Unfinished Business. It's by Stephen Okazaki. It's from mid 80s, 1980s, and it's fantastic. Stephen has done amazing work about the incarceration experience. There's also a beautiful film he made called Days of Waiting about a Caucasian woman who went into camp with her Japanese American husband. So if you're interested in this topic, those films are definitely worth checking out. Again, the filmmaker Stephen Okazaki, and Unfinished Business is specifically about Min Yasui, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Fred Korematsu.
So this connects a little bit with the next question that's come up, and that is from, I don't know how to even say this. It's not really a name. It's more of a handle. But why are Niseis hesitant to share their experiences initially? So why were Niseis hesitant to share their stories when they first came out of camp, and I would say for years afterwards?
Let me go with that. I was very active with the Japanese American Citizens League, and one of the things that I was involved in was to try to get redress for our war experience. And I tried to get the members of our JACL chapter to back this up, but I was approached by 442 veterans from the local area saying, "Ben, forget about it. Just let bygones be bygones, and let's just not rock the boat." So I had to get with the JCL chapter district and put out a questionnaire to our membership to say, do we want to go for redress? And 80% did say yes, and we should go ahead. So we had one time the Japanese community, many of the veterans especially, were against it. Then once we start going with the redress, then the veterans did come out, and thank goodness for the many of the 442nd groups and so on. We were able to pass that redress after 20 years of efforts to try to get everything working. But at one point there, the Japanese community just didn't want to rock the boat, so to speak, for redress. I remember having to go through all this, and it took 20 years to finally get that thing passed.
So the next question we have is from Satsuka Winchester again. And the question is, so people speak glibly of returnees losing their land, but how exactly did they lose it? Was it stolen, or was it taken by the country or the state, or by failure to pay taxes?
Tom, Solano County, which is adjacent to Contra Costa County, is right north of us. There was an extensive group of farmers, Japanese farmers, over 100. And of those 100 farmers, less than 10% returned to Solano County. For my family, the reason that we were able to return was that Mr. Aby made enough income on our property that he paid the property taxes to Contra Costa County. Also, since we did have the mortgage at Mechanics Bank, Mr. Downer never called on any of us to pay on our mortgage because, of course, we were unable to pay. In Solano County, the people that were in the camps were not able to pay the property taxes unless they had someone honest operating their farms. And if they had a mortgage, those properties that the farmers had, most of those people in Solano County were orchardists. They had extensive farms, very, very large, their homes, all of the farm equipment. And if they had a mortgage on their property, they couldn't pay it to the bank. There was someone willing to take that mortgage. So that's the big difference for my family living in Contra Costa County and the farmers that were in Solano County.
I think another aspect of it is we can be literal about losing their land, but there's also the opportunism and profiteering that occurred when people knew, like, oh, these people have to all leave, and people were buying stuff, you know, for a fraction of their actual worth, and for the families, they didn't really feel like they had any choice. Tom actually told a great story. Tom Oishi told me a great story about they had a beautiful automobile that was part of the family's pride, and they parked it in the garage. And then when they knew that this was going to happen, they parked it in the garage. They planted trees in front of the garage. They hid the car so that no one actually even knew it was there, and it managed to retain it that way. But you think about the opportunism, the profiteering, and then you also think about the loss of income that people had, where people were in the prime of their lives and were building businesses, and then suddenly they were evacuated. And another aspect that we talked about in the interviews for the doc but didn't make it in was, for a lot of the Richmond area growers, they had nurseries that were right near what eventually became, I think it was Interstate 80. It was either 80 or 580. And so we had people who were moved out because the government said you have to go, and then 10 years later come back, reestablish their businesses, and then eminent domain says, no, you got to move again. And again, it's like no choice in the matter. So I don't want to be too literal about the losing their land, but just say, like, there's a larger, broader way to think about that.
My father was a landscape gardener, and so in San Mateo, our aunt and uncle, they were Niseis, and so they were able to buy property in San Mateo. So they made a shed and put all his gardening tools inside there and locked it to hopefully have it when we came back. But when we came back out of camp 4.5 years later, we found that the lock was broken and all the tools and everything inside that shed were taken out and stolen. This was in my aunt's home, but someone just, no one's there, so they just went ransackled the shed and took home. So my father had to start all over again, and so he didn't live long enough. He died at 55, almost right after coming back from camp, because he was the breadwinner, because the rest of us, we had a big family, and we were still going to high school and so on, so we couldn't help with the income earning for our family. So anyway, he had a rough time, although he didn't complain at all about doing all this.
So I think some folks have probably noticed that we have a fourth panelist that is hiding in the background. We have Yoko Olsgaard, who is assisting Ben with the technology, but she doesn't just assist with technology, she also plays a role in the Contra Costa JACL. And so we really thank her for her work with the JACL and for her assistance today, helping Ben out with the technology.
Thank you.
So thanks, Yoko. And a question, which actually Yoko might know a little bit about too. A question came in from Hiro. And the question is this video shared with the local high school history classes and/or Asian student union clubs? So I don't know who will know that. I don't know what work the JACL is doing to get this released out further, but does anybody know?
I go to Richmond High School, which is my alma mater, and I speak to a government class every year. Of course, I didn't go this year because of our shelter in place, but I do share the video and I do speak afterwards.
Great.
Our video is sold at the Rosie the Riveter Museum shop, and it's also on eBay.
You can also get it, I believe, at the Japanese American National Museum online, at JANM online.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions at the moment. And we're coming up on the end of our hour. So I want to thank the panelists for participating today and encourage you, when we open back up the Visitor Center, if you're local in Richmond, please try to come down. You can meet Flora and or Ben at the Visitor Center. They can share their stories with you there. And you can also see some of the other stuff that goes on. As Flora mentioned, we have Betty Soskin, our 98-year-old park ranger, who shares her story as well. So please come down, and thank you all for participating in the panel today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having
very
us.
much.
I appreciate it.